My name doesn't matter. What matters is that for 32 years, I was the daughter who never needed anything. I want you to understand that before I tell you what happened on my wedding day, because it explains everything. It explains why I wrote a check for $18,000 without arguing. It explains why I smiled through my own reception while holding a secret in my chest like a stone. And it explains why by sunset, 200 people at my wedding knew the truth about my family, a truth I had spent my entire life protecting them from. I grew up in a small brick house in Ohio, the kind with a swing set in the backyard that eventually rusted from disuse because nobody ever fixed it. My brother Daniel is 3 years younger than me. From the moment he was born, I understood the way children understand things without being told that he was the one the world was supposed to revolve around. It wasn't cruelty exactly. My parents never sat me down and said, "We love your brother more." They didn't have to. It showed in 1,000 small ways. When I made honor roll, my father nodded and went back to his newspaper. When Daniel brought home a C, my mother framed his report card because at least he tried. When I got into college on a partial scholarship, I was told how proud they were for about 10 minutes until the conversation drifted back to Daniel's basketball tryouts. I want to be fair. My parents weren't monsters. My father worked construction for 30 years, came home with dust in the creases of his hands, and never missed a mortgage payment. My mother substitute taught at the elementary school and made sure there was always dinner on the table. They loved us. But love in that house was never distributed evenly. It pooled around Daniel like water finds the lowest point in a room. By the time I was 22, I had learned not to expect anything. I put myself through the rest of school working 2 jobs. I lived in a studio apartment with a mattress on the floor for the first year after graduation. I built a career in logistics management slowly, painfully, one promotion at a time with nobody's help. Every dollar I have, I earned with my own hands. And I am proud of that in a way I don't think my family ever understood. Because for them, struggle was something you fixed by asking family for help. For me, struggle was something you fixed by refusing to ask anyone for anything ever again. Daniel, meanwhile, drifted. He started 3 different businesses that folded within a year. He married young, had 2 kids young, and somehow always landed exactly where he needed to be caught. Usually in my parents' outstretched arms, sometimes literally moving back into their house for just a few months. That stretched into 2 years. Every time my parents found a reason. He has kids to think about. He's under so much stress. He just needs one more chance. I never got a chance. I never needed one. And somewhere along the way, that became the same thing in my parents' eyes as not needing anything at all. When I met Marcus 4 years ago, everything in my life started to feel like it was finally clicking into place. He was steady where my family was chaotic. He noticed things, my birthday, the anniversary of small milestones, the way I flinched slightly whenever my phone rang, and it was my mother's name on the screen. He asked me once gently why I always looked braced before I answered. I didn't have a good answer for him then. I do now. We got engaged on a Tuesday in October in the kitchen of our apartment. No big production, just him getting down on one knee while I was mid-sentence about grocery lists, both of us laughing so hard I could barely say yes. I called my mother that night, genuinely excited, wanting still, after everything, for her to be excited with me. She was, for about 90 seconds. Then she asked if Daniel and his wife would be able to afford the trip to wherever we decided to have the wedding, because you know how tight things are for them right now. I should have heard that as a warning. I didn't. I heard it as background noise, the same static that had followed every good thing in my life since I was a child. I planned my wedding anyway. I paid for almost all of it myself with Marcus, exactly the way I'd paid for everything else in my life. And on a warm Saturday in June, I got dressed in a bridal suite that smelled like lilies and hairspray, feeling for the first time in longer than I could remember completely uncomplicatedly happy. That happiness lasted until 11:40 that morning. The bridal suite was on the 2nd floor of the venue, a converted farmhouse with big windows that let in gold morning light. My bridesmaids had just stepped out to grab coffee. My mother was downstairs fussing with the guest book, and my father knocked twice, then let himself in without waiting for an answer the way he always had. "You look beautiful," he said, and for one soft moment, I believed the day was going to be exactly what I'd hoped for. Then he asked if we could talk. Alone, just for a minute. I remember the specific strange calm that settled over me, the calm of a person who has learned over 3 decades to read a room before anyone speaks. Something in his posture was wrong. He wasn't standing like a father about to walk his daughter down the aisle. He was standing like a man rehearsing a request. "Your brother's in trouble," he said. I asked what kind of trouble, already knowing in some tired corner of my mind that whatever it would somehow end up being mine to fix. $18,000. Credit card debt accumulated over 2 years of a failed business venture Daniel hadn't told anyone about until the collection calls started coming to my parents' house because he'd listed their number as a backup contact. The interest had ballooned it from an original balance closer to $12,000. His wife didn't fully know the extent of it. The bank was threatening to garnish wages, and apparently it needed to be resolved today. Because Daniel had finally agreed to let someone help him, and my father didn't want to lose the momentum of that agreement. I asked very quietly why he was telling me this in my wedding dress 40 minutes before I was supposed to walk down an aisle. "Because you're the only one who has it," he said, like that settled the matter. Like the fact of my own hard-won stability was in itself an obligation to everyone who hadn't built the same thing. I said no. I want you to know that I did say no first. I said we could talk about it after the wedding, after the honeymoon, that this was not the time, that I deserved one single day that wasn't about managing my brother's life. My father's face did something I'd seen before 100 times across 30 years, a kind of practiced disappointment engineered specifically to make you feel like the unreasonable one. "He has a family to feed," he said. "2 kids, Rachel. You don't have kids. You don't understand what it's like to watch your child struggle and not be able to help. You're just being dramatic. It's one morning. Nobody's asking you to give up your wedding." I want to tell you that I saw through it instantly that some steel-spined version of myself stood up and told him exactly where he could put that request. That's not what happened. What happened is that 32 years of conditioning did what conditioning does. It went looking for the path of least conflict, and it found it the way it always had. But something else happened too. Something new. Underneath the old, tired compliance, a second feeling was rising, one I didn't fully recognize yet, because I'd never let myself feel it in front of him before. It wasn't sadness. It was clarity, cold and precise, arriving like a held breath finally released. I said I would write the check. My father's shoulders dropped in relief, already halfway out the door, already moving on to whatever came next in his morning, because for him the matter was closed. He had gotten what he came for. He had no idea that something in me had just quietly, permanently changed. I sat down at the small writing desk in the corner of the bridal suite, still in my wedding dress, veil pinned but not yet down, and I wrote a check for $18,000 to my brother. My hand did not shake. I want that detail remembered because everyone who has heard this story assumes I must have been crying, must have been furious, in some visible dramatic way. I wasn't. I was perfectly still. I signed my name the way I sign everything clean, unhurried, final. Then I asked my father to send Daniel up to the suite for a moment alone before the ceremony. Daniel came up looking sheepish. The particular sheepishness of a man who knows he's been caught needing help again and has decided the fastest way through the discomfort is to get it over with. He thanked me. He said it wouldn't happen again. I had heard that sentence in one form or another since I was 9 years old. I told him I needed him to sign something before I handed over the check. "Just a formality," I said. My accountant had recommended it given the size of the amount for tax and gift reporting purposes. I kept my voice light, almost bored, the tone of someone doing paperwork, not the tone of someone building a case. I handed him a single type page. I had drafted it myself 2 nights earlier at 2 in the morning, unable to sleep. Some instinct in me already sensing that this exact scene was coming, though I couldn't have told you why. It wasn't complicated. It stated the amount. It stated that this was being provided as a loan, not a gift, with a simple repayment structure over 3 years. And it stated in one clean paragraph near the bottom, a full accounting of every major financial gift or bailout my parents had given Daniel over the preceding 15 years each one. I had quietly kept track of, without ever telling anyone why the failed food truck, the 2 rounds of temporary rent, covered for 8 months at a stretch, the truck loan co-signed and then absorbed when he stopped paying the wedding they'd helped fund for him and his wife, with money they told me at the time they simply didn't have available for mine. Daniel skimmed it the way people skim things they've decided in advance to sign. He asked what the last part was for. I told him it was just context for the accountant's standard practice for family loans this size, nothing to worry about. He signed it. My father, waiting in the hallway, signed it too, as a witness without reading it closely, eager to be done and get back downstairs before guests started arriving. I remember exactly how the pen felt in my hand when I signed beneath them, heavier than it should have been, the way objects feel heavier when you understand you're doing something that cannot be undone. I remember the specific rustle of my dress against the chair. I remember thinking with a strange, quiet calm, this is the first time in my life I have ever told the truth about this family, and no one in this room realizes it yet. 20 minutes later, I was walking down the aisle on my father's arm, smiling at 200 faces radiant in every photograph that would later fill my wedding album. Nobody looking at those pictures would ever guess what was folded inside my clutch, tucked beside my lipstick and a spare bobby pin, a copy of a document that was about to unravel a lifetime of silence. The ceremony itself is a blur of good memory. Marcus's face when I came around the corner, my mother crying in the front row, the specific warmth of standing under a floral arch and promising a future to someone who had never once made me feel invisible. I want that part remembered as pure because it was. The reception was where the day split in two. Dinner went smoothly. Toasts were warm. Marcus's brother made everyone cry. My maid of honor made everyone laugh. Daniel gave a short, slightly awkward toast about how proud he was of his big sister, and I watched my parents beam at him for simply standing up and speaking the same automatic pride they'd shown him his entire life for doing ordinary things. It was during the first dance set, somewhere around 8:30, that Daniel found me near the edge of the dance floor. His tie loosened, a drink in his hand, his face doing something uneasy. "Hey," he said, "I read that thing again, on the way over here, the whole thing." I didn't say anything. I just watched him. That last part," he said, "about mom and dad, about everything they've given me over the years. Why is that in a loan agreement? Rachel, what is that actually for?" I told him the truth quietly, evenly, the way you'd read someone a weather report. I told him it was for me. Not for the accountant, not for taxes, for me. Because for 15 years I had watched my parents fund his life in pieces over and over while telling me again and again in a dozen different ways that I didn't need help because I'd never asked for any. And I had decided 2 nights before my own wedding, apparently correctly, that if I was going to be asked to hand over $18,000 on the happiest day of my life, then for once, just once, there was going to be a written, signed, undeniable record of exactly what this family had actually cost me and what it had never once given me in return. Daniel's face went through several things at once: confusion, then something closer to shame, then a kind of dawning horror as he understood what he'd actually signed his name to on my wedding day in front of a witness who also happened to be our father. He set his drink down on a nearby table. His hand wasn't quite steady. "Dad's going to lose it," he said. "Dad already signed it," I said. "He witnessed it, he just didn't read it." Daniel stood very still for a long moment, the music and the laughter of 200 guests swirling around us, like we were standing in a bubble of silence. And then he said the sentence that later more than one guest would tell me. They overheard the sentence that would end up traveling through that reception like a current through water. "Dad," he whispered more to himself than to me staring at nothing. It was never about the money. He was right, and he knew it the moment he said it out loud. It had never been about the money, not the $18,000, not the food truck, not the truck alone, not any of it. It had been about being seen, about being the child who mattered enough to be worried over, bailed out, forgiven, funded, versus being the child who was simply expected to be fine forever, no matter what it cost her, because she had made the fatal mistake of never falling down in public. Daniel asked me to come with him to find our parents. I almost said no. Then I thought about every silent Thanksgiving, where I'd swallowed something similar every birthday, where I'd told myself it didn't matter every single time I'd absorbed an unfairness without a word, because it wasn't the right moment. It was never the right moment. And I realized that if I didn't do this now in daylight with witnesses, there would never be a right moment. There would only be more silence. Stretching all the way to my parents' eventual funerals, where I would stand at the front row being thanked for handling everything the way I always had. We found them near the cake table. My mother was fixing my father's boutonniere. Daniel, to his credit, and I will give him this fully because it mattered, didn't soften it. He held up the folded paper and asked our father flatly in front of my mother whether he had actually read what he'd signed that morning. My father hadn't. When Daniel read the last paragraph aloud quietly, but not quietly enough because a small cluster of nearby guests had already started to notice something was wrong, my mother's face went the color of the tablecloth. The number laid out in cold specific detail was hard to argue with. Over 15 years, the food truck 41,000, the rent coverage roughly 19,000 across 2 stretches, the truck loan absorbed after Daniel stopped paying another 12,000, their contribution to his wedding 8,000 at a time when they told me they had nothing extra for mine. And now this 18,000 more demanded on the morning of the one day that was supposed to be entirely, finally mine. I didn't raise my voice. I want that understood clearly because I've thought about this moment 100 times since, and the thing I'm proudest of is that I never once became the loud, dramatic daughter my father had accused me of being that morning. I simply stood there in my wedding dress and asked one question. Can either of you tell me one thing, just one, that you have ever given me unprompted, the way you've given Daniel? Not because I asked, not because I was drowning, just because you loved me and wanted to. Nobody answered. Not because there wasn't an answer somewhere buried in 32 years of birthdays and Christmases, but because in that moment, standing in front of a folded page with 15 years of numbers on it, nobody could produce one fast enough for it to matter. By then, word had moved through the reception the way it always does at these things, not through shouting, but through the particular electric quiet of people pretending not to have heard something enormous. By the time the sun started going down over the farmhouse fields, casting that long gold light across the dance floor, I would guess close to 200 people at that wedding had some version of the story whispered table to table between bites of cake. The bride paid off her brother's debt the morning of her own wedding and then made him sign for it. My mother cried the real kind, not the performative kind I'd watched her produce for Daniel's problems over the years. My father didn't say much of anything. He is not and has never been a man built for that kind of reckoning in public, and I watched something in him deflate not into an apology, not yet, but into a silence that was for him its own kind of admission. I didn't get the moment you see in movies. Nobody fell to their knees. Nobody delivered a perfect, tearful apology that undid 3 decades in one sentence. What I got instead was smaller and in its own way more honest. By sunset, as the string lights came on over the dance floor and the DJ eased into slower songs, my father found me near the edge of the tent. He didn't apologize outright. That still hasn't fully happened even now months later. But he said something I never expected to hear from him. I didn't know you were keeping count. I told him the truth. I hadn't wanted to keep count. I had wanted my whole life not to need to. Daniel apologized properly later that week. Over the phone, his voice cracking in a way I'd never heard from him before. He told me he was going to actually repay the loan and the terms in the document, not because he legally had to, but because he finally understood what it had cost me to write that check in the first place and what it had cost me quietly for 30 years before that. I won't pretend the $18,000 is fully repaid yet. It isn't. But something else got repaid that day, something I hadn't even realized I was owed until I finally collected it, the simple adult right to be taken seriously in my own family on my own terms without having to fall apart first to earn it. My mother and I are still working things out. It's slower than I like. Old patterns don't dissolve in one golden hour at a farmhouse wedding, no matter how satisfying the story sounds afterward. But something shifted permanently that day, and everyone at that reception, 200 people who came to watch me marry Marcus and left having witnessed something else, entirely knew it too. I think about that morning often, the calm that came over me in that bridal suite, the steadiness of my hand as I signed beneath my brother's name. People sometimes ask if I regret making the wedding about that. I don't. My wedding was never about a piece of paper. It was about the moment I finally understood that being the reliable one doesn't mean being the invisible one, and that the 2 people who taught me otherwise needed for once to sit in the discomfort of seeing that clearly, in daylight, surrounded by everyone who loved us. Marcus held my hand through all of it, that whole day steady the way he always is. When the last guests left and the string lights dimmed and it was finally just the 2 of us standing on the empty dance floor, he asked me if I was okay. I told him the truth. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I was.